The smell of wood smoke, infused with resin and frost, hung thick in the air of the small hut that served as Ivan Andreevich Belov's home, office, refuge, and fortress. He was 48 years old, but his wiry, weather-beaten figure and thick strands of gray hair in his closely cropped head made many people think he was 10 years older. Now he sat by the only window, scrutinizing the blade of his old hunting knife in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. His slow, hoarse breathing was the only sound, except for the silence, which in itself was a full-fledged, tangible entity in these parts, living and breathing in unison with the taiga. Every movement of Voron, as he had long been nicknamed for his imperturbable, heavy, and incredibly attentive gaze, was unhurried, honed by years spent on the invisible border between law and wild nature. He disliked fuss, considering it a sign of amateurism and weakness, especially when it came to matters requiring a mind as sharp as this knife. Outside the window lay a deep, pre-winter night, full of rustling shadows and the promise of the first real snow. His faithful West Siberian Laika, whom he called Shadow, lay by the stove, and her calm, steady breathing was Ivan's best barometer of safety. If Shadow was calm, then the taiga was calm. But even in this perfect silence, there was always something hanging in the air, something that Ivan had learned to sense with his whole skin: tension. Today, this tension was special, not natural, but imported, alien. Perhaps it was simply a reflection of his own gloomy thoughts, which often came to him after he left his position as Senior State Inspector of the Sian Nature Reserve. Or perhaps it was the invisible but inevitable call of the world, from which he tried to shield himself with the thick logs of his home. The thick, reliable silence was broken by the piercing, grating sound of an old satellite phone lying on a wooden table. The shadow instantly raised its head, but did not bark, only turned its intelligent, amber gaze to its owner. This device, which drove him crazy with its unreliability and bad weather, was the only thread connecting Voron with the mainland, and, more importantly, with those who sometimes needed his specific skills: the art of reading tracks, the ability to understand the logic of a person driven into the wilderness, and his unerring knowledge of the taiga itself. Ivan put down the knife, his movements remaining calm, but the muscles of his face, as if carved from stone, tensed slightly. He knew that the call would not bring anything good. They don't call during the day. During the day, people manage on their own. It was Captain Efremov calling, young compared to Voron, but already seasoned enough by local realities to know that if a trail leads from a gravel road deep into the forest, all their modern gadgets and protocols become useless. Efremov's voice, distorted by satellite interference, was surprisingly dry and devoid of official bravado. "Ivan Andreevich, it's me again. This time it's bad." Far away. Voron listened, holding the phone to his ear, his gaze calm, like a bird of prey watching for prey, fixed on the void. He didn't ask unnecessary questions or interrupt, allowing Efremov to spill out all the details, fragments of which reached Ivan like separate words from a secret language. The case concerned a murder. "A brutal one," Efremov emphasized, "unusually brutal." The body was found 15 kilometers from the nearest winter road, in a place where tourists don't stray, and locals only go on business. The victim was a poacher, Sergei, nicknamed Redhead. And here, at this name, Ivan's calmness cracked invisibly, as if in a block of ice.
The hand holding the phone clenched, and his eyes closed for a moment, letting out a short but heavy sigh. Redhead.
Several years ago, when Voron was still wearing a uniform, he stumbled upon Ryzhy deep in the reserve. Ryzhy was trapping fur animals using illegal nets, but not for sale on the black market on an industrial scale. For his family.
At the time, he had a sick wife and 3 children. Ivan remembered this incident in detail because he had broken his own protocol at the time.
He could have turned Redhead in, which would have meant a fine and prison, which would have guaranteed the destruction of this family. Instead, he took all the catch and gear, gave Red some canned meat and ammunition, and sent him back with a single stern warning that Red understood. Live by the unwritten law. Not for profit, but for life. This act of mercy, or as Ivan called it to himself, an act of restoring balance, was part of his personal code. You are a guardian, not a punisher. He determined that Redhead was not a sick individual who kills for pleasure or greed. He was a hunted animal, hunting to feed his cubs. Raven then decided that the law of the taiga was more important than the law of the criminal code in this case, and Redhead was released on his word, which for a taiga man should have been worth more than his life. And now this Redhead lay dead, killed. And, judging by Efremov's remarks, he was not killed by the police, nor in a shootout with gamekeepers. The tracks, they smeared everything there, Efremov croaked. But we know for sure, this is not self-defense. It looks like some kind of wild revenge, but why so far away? No one would look for him there. You need to come, Ivan Andreevich. You know what happens when the trail goes off the asphalt. Voron was silent. He saw Ryzhy's face before him, exhausted but full of determination. He remembered his own choice, which seemed like it would be his salvation, but now had turned into death. If Ryzhy was killed, it meant he had broken his oath. That meant Ivan had been wrong to show leniency. The conflict that instantly flared up inside Raven was sharp and painful. He didn't take this case on orders. He didn't care about police reports or statistical reports. He took it as a personal challenge. He had to find out what happened to the only one he, Raven, had spared. If Redhead had died because his mercy had been a sign of weakness or a misjudgment of the human soul, then his own hard-earned code of honor, his internal system of justice, had been violated. He had to restore order, restore the balance that he himself had once upset. Ivan felt that the true killer had taken not just a life, but part of his right to judge. And that had to be corrected. Come at dawn, Captain. Voron's low, hoarse voice sounded heavy and slow, like the movement of an ancient glacier. Here are the coordinates, details when we meet. Just know, independent action on site. No one touches anything. Yefremov promised with relief to do exactly that. When the connection was broken, Ivan held the phone for a long time. He looked at the knife he had recently sharpened and saw in its mirrored surface not his own reflection, but the shadow of the man he had failed to save, the shadow of guilt. He got up and put on an old, well-worn, functional jacket. The shadow, as if reading his unspoken decision, rose from the floor and silently pressed itself against his leg. The night in the taiga was no longer cozy and quiet. It became the beginning of a hunt, where the prey was not an animal, but a forgotten law. And this law was far more terrifying than any written by humans on paper. He fastened his knife belt and took his binoculars. The road to the crime scene lay through the morning gloom and through his own heavy memories. He had to find out exactly why Ryzhy had died. They reached the crime scene by noon. The meeting with Captain Efremov at the edge of the winter road was quick and without ceremony. Ivan did not waste time on greetings or questions about personnel. He immediately demanded maps and clarified exactly how Sergei Redhead had been found. The information was scarce. A group of local lumberjacks had stumbled upon the body, covered with a thin layer of fresh snow which, fortunately for Voron, had not completely ruined the scene. Efremov tried to start with the protocol, with explanations of how they had cordoned off the area and what they had already managed to do. But Ivan, who was nicknamed Raven for a reason, cut him off mid-sentence with a single glance. Heavy, calm, full of hidden contempt. It was a look at amateurs who, stepping on the ground, saw nothing but dirt, while for him, this land was an open book. Ivan immediately moved forward, leaving Efremov in helpless anger and confusion. The shadow walked ahead, moving silently, like a liquid shadow on the snow, and its behavior was more important than all the policeman's words. Leica showed neither hunting excitement nor fear, only alert curiosity. This confirmed what Ivan already suspected. There was no wild animal here, no accidental skirmish. There was cold, deliberate calculation. Ivan did not rush. His method was not to rush along the trail, but to slow himself down to the pace of the taiga, merge with it, and begin to listen. His eyes, burned by the sun and wind, saw what remained invisible to others. Not just tracks, but a story told through broken branches, displaced moss, and patches of earth exposed by the melting snow. The place where Ryzhy lay was a small clearing surrounded by dense cedar trees. The first thing that struck Raven was the obvious incompetence of the police. They trampled around the perimeter like a herd of frightened moose, destroying important details and mixing their dirty boots with the traces left by the killer. Raven ignored them as he approached the body. The redhead was lying on his back, his face contorted not in fear but in surprise. Death had come suddenly, professionally. The blow had been delivered with something heavy to the head and neck, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was how he had been left. The killer, or those who did it, did not try to hide the body, which would have been logical for an ordinary criminal. They left it demonstratively, as if putting it on public display. It was a gesture, a message. Next to the body, partially covered with snow, lay the remains of Redhead's hunting equipment, a primitive but effective trap, several meters of fishing line for snares, and a crude knife. And what caught Raven's attention most were 4 large, freshly removed sable skins, and the carcass of a roe deer, clearly killed recently. It was not just one, but several heads of prey, clearly excessive. Greed. The raven crouched down, touching neither the body nor the ground, so as not to disturb the already fragile scene. He carefully examined the dead man. There were no signs of struggle or resistance on his clothes or backpack. The murder was silent, sudden, and most importantly, expected by the victim. Redhead knew his killer, or at least knew of his presence. Redhead himself said so. Or rather, his position indicated this. The body did not have time to make a defensive movement, which ruled out a sudden attack from ambush. Most likely, he was distracted by conversation, or the killer approached him from a direction Ryzhy did not expect. Raven scanned the perimeter. He was looking not just for clues, but for the logic behind the crime. If it had been a robbery, the loot would have been stolen. If it had been revenge for a personal quarrel, the body would have been dumped somewhere along the road. But here, in the wilderness, next to the display of the victim's greed, it looked different. Ivan followed the barely visible footprints in the snow. Redhead's footprints coming from one side, and the killer's footprints coming from the other. The killer's footprints were clean, clear, pointing to one person. Strong, experienced, with a light, confident step. The person was carrying a small but, judging by the depth of the footprint, perfectly balanced load. They say it was a quarrel. Maybe over the spoils, muttered one of the detectives, a young man with frightened eyes breaking the silence. Voron, without turning around, suppressed the urge to interrupt him rudely. A quarrel. Nonsense. If it had been a quarrel, there would have been signs of a struggle, screams, scattered belongings. Here, however, there was order in death. The killer had not rushed. He had come, done his job, left a message, and left. Following his instinct, Raven stepped away from the body and focused on what was a little further away, the place where Redhead had probably gathered his prey. There he found something that confirmed his growing suspicions. In addition to fresh traces of moose and sable, there were obvious signs of overhunting. Not just 2 or 3 traps, a dozen snares set too close together too often. This was not for sustenance. This was for profit. The Redhead, whom Ivan had spared because of his poverty and the need to feed his family, had obviously broken his oath. He had crossed the line between a hunter who takes to live and a poacher who takes to get rich. And then Ivan found the key piece of evidence that confirmed his conclusions. A few meters from the body, under a cedar branch where the snow had barely settled, he saw a print. It was not a footprint from a shoe or boot, but a mark left on the ground by someone crouching down. Someone had been sitting here, watching. And next to this footprint, barely noticeable, covered by a piece of moss, lay a tiny piece of birch bark, held to the ground by a thin strip of leather. Ivan picked it up. It was not even a talisman in the full sense of the word, but rather a mark, a very old, dried bone attached to birch bark, a sign that, as he knew, belonged to only one very closed and conservative community of taiga hunters, who lived by their ancient, unwritten laws. These people believed that nature itself punished those who disturbed the balance, but sometimes chose its own executor to restore that balance. Voron looked at the excess prey left beside the body, at the professionalism of the killing, and at the mark. Then he looked at Yefremov, who was waiting for him to say something, to offer some kind of explanation.
"This is not a quarrel, Captain." The Raven's voice was even, emotionless. "And it's not a robbery, and it's not police work. This doesn't look like an accidental death. There was a judge here, and Redhead was executed for greed." He felt a cold certainty pierce him to the bone. This was not a criminal case in the usual sense. It was an execution. Someone had decided that Redhead had become a sick individual, threatening the entire taiga, and had decided to remove him from the ecosystem. And Redhead, whom Ivan had once let go, thereby violated not only the law of the taiga, but also the personal
unspoken code of Raven himself, making his mercy a fatal mistake. Now Ivan had to see this case through to the end, to understand what exactly he had done wrong several years ago. He had to catch the executor to restore his own shaken order. He put the birchbark with the bone in his pocket, hiding it from Yefremov's eyes, and walked away from the crime scene, leaving the police to flounder in their guesses. His path lay to abandoned villages, to old hunters, to the shadows of Ryzhy's past, to the very essence of taiga justice. The village that Sergei Redhead called home was essentially a cluster of dilapidated log cabins, abandoned 30 years ago, and only partially inhabited by people who had not found their place in a world where asphalt and the internet were more important than the ability to read the stars and repair a stove. Voron arrived here in the evening, driving an old but reliable SUV, along barely visible tracks that became impassable swamps in the off-season. He did not inform Captain Efremov of his visit. The police were not needed here. Their arrival would only scare away the shadows and silence the people who would hide behind the deaf walls of mistrust. Ivan stopped on the outskirts before reaching the main street, which was nothing more than an uneven, dirty path. The shadow, following him silently, sniffed at an old, fallen pole, the paint long since peeled off. As he got out of the car, Raven immediately sensed that something was wrong here. Despite the freshness of the taiga, the air was heavy, saturated with the smell of fear, and even worse, the smell of someone else's undeserved death. He headed for the hut, from whose chimney thin bluish smoke curled, a sign that someone lived here permanently. The owner, an old bachelor named Zakhar, greeted him without surprise, as if he had been waiting for Raven to appear on his doorstep. Zakhar, with his wrinkled, dried mushroom-like face and deep-set eyes, was one of those who had known the taiga since birth, but had long since switched to a peaceful, albeit meager, existence, getting by with odd jobs and collecting pine cones. He knew all the gossip, all the unwritten laws, and all the secret paths. Voron did not waste time on preliminaries. He simply sat down on the bench, let shadow settle in, and pouring himself some hot tea, which Zakhar silently placed on the table, said, "Sergei has been killed." Zakhar didn't flinch. His reaction was even worse. He sighed heavily. His gaze became empty, filled with old, inescapable sadness. "I heard. I knew it would happen." Things went badly with Ryzhy. This badly was much more important to Voron than any speculation about quarrels. It pointed to a moral decline, a certain violation of order, which in the eyes of the locals was worse than any criminal offense. Ivan began to ask questions. Slowly, unhurriedly, giving Zakhar the opportunity to emphasize certain points himself. It turned out that, after the incident with Voron, Ryzhy had kept himself together for a while. He hunted in permitted areas, took only what he needed, sold honestly, and even helped his neighbors. But then, according to Zakhar, the city woke up in him. Ryzhy's wife, Valentina, began to demand more. Not just food and firewood, but a beautiful life. New things, a stove, a TV that would run on a generator instead of a battery. And Sergei, cornered by these new, artificial needs, began to break down. He became greedy. Greed is rust, Ivan Andreevich. Zakhar shook his head, and this gesture was full of deep philosophical meaning. You can't get rid of it. It ruins everything. He didn't start for his family. He started for himself, for a new jacket, for glitter in the house. And the taiga does not tolerate such things. It gives you what you need to survive. not to live in luxury. Zahar's story gradually painted a picture of how Ryzhy, consumed by an inner fire, began to break all the unwritten rules. He switched to large prey that would bring quick and high profits. Raw deer, which were forbidden to touch at that time, and even bears. Moreover, he hunted them not for meat, but for skins and bile, which could be sold profitably to middlemen who brought vodka and city news to the village. Most importantly, Ryzhy began to use prohibited, barbaric methods. He set snares and traps in places where it was traditionally not accepted, including on other people's land. He took more than he could process, leaving carcasses to rot. He began to ruin the land. Zakar struggled to say the phrase, which for him was the most terrible crime. Not just poaching, but desecration. Damaging the land that feeds everyone. No one would have killed him if he had just stolen. But he destroyed. The raven listened without interrupting, his heavy gaze fixed on the old man's face. The inner conflict he had brought with him from his secluded home only intensified. His mercy toward a man who hunted for his family carried with it a tragic mistake. He gave him a chance to survive, according to the law of the taiga. But Redhead preferred the law of the city, the law of consumption and excess. He himself became the very sick individual that Ivan had once promised to remove from the ecosystem. He broke the most important commandment that all hunters who lived in harmony with nature observed. Do not take more than you need. The development of the situation described by Zakar showed how the hunting community, of which Redhead was once a part, began to avoid him. At first, it was just sidelong glances. Then, unwillingness to share a fire or a road with him. Finally, complete expulsion. Redhead was no longer invited to joint hunts, and no one spoke to him. He became a stranger among his own people. It was not just social punishment, it was a taiga curse. A person who is not accepted by the taiga and its community is doomed. He was warned, Ivan Andreevich, more than once. Zakar lowered his voice. They said that if he didn't stop, the taiga itself would come for him. But he laughed. He said that the taiga was just a forest, and money was the real power. The conflict reached its peak in Zakar's story. The last straw was when Ryzhy left an open, uncamouflaged trap for large animals, which nearly caught a child from a neighboring community. This was no longer greed, but a direct threat. It was after this incident, as Zakar recounted, but the elders, or as he called them, the guardians of the community, made a tacit decision. Zakar did not name names, but his eyes, full of fear and respect, spoke of a person, or people, whom they feared but obeyed. They were not seeking revenge. They were seeking protection. They saw Ryzhy not as a poacher, but as a plague that could attract inspectors, police, and gold miners to their lands, who would completely destroy their fragile way of life. Ivan stood up. Now he understood the motive for the murder. It wasn't a criminal murder in the police sense. It was a sentence. The execution of a sentence for violating the highest unwritten law, the law of balance. The perpetrator, whom Voron now had to find, did not act out of personal hatred, but as an instrument of taiga justice. But that did not change the fact that murder was still murder. Seeing that Ivan was about to leave, Zakhar whispered quietly, "Don't look for him, Ivan Andreevich. Just find a false trail for the police, and let it go. The taiga will figure out who is right." Voron did not answer. He nodded, thanked Zakhar for the information, and went out into the street. Now he knew what he was looking for. Not a criminal murderer, but an executioner who believed himself to be right. And that truth was far more complicated than any lie. The shadow was already waiting for him by the car, sniffing the air impatiently. Ahead lay the real, dense taiga, where the killer's trail had disappeared. And now, Raven knew that this trail belonged not just to a man, but to the voice of the taiga. The path of Ivan Andreevich and the shadow. From the abandoned village led not to the road, but away from any civilization, to where the taiga began to live by its own prehistoric rules. Voron knew that the executor, as he had nicknamed the killer Redhead, would not hide along the winter road or try to blend in with people. A man who takes it upon himself to administer taiga justice fears neither the law nor people. He fears only his own conscience and the wrath of the forest. And Raven sought that wrath, that trail, which was like an open book to him, written in the most accurate and honest ink. Moisture, moss, and earth. The shadow moved as an extension of his own will, its nose working flawlessly, picking up not just human scent, but what Ivan called a mental trail, a person's state of mind, their goal, and their inner tension, imprinted on every step. Here, on the edge of the dense taiga, where the snow lay in a thicker, untouched layer, the real work began. It was not a search, but a reading. Voron walked slowly, his heavy, calm gaze gliding over the ground, not missing the slightest detail. He saw not just boot prints, but a whole story unfolding in his head. The killer was strong, as Raven had determined at the crime scene. But here, on the long walk, it became clear that he was not just strong, but incredibly resilient. His stride was perfectly even, without the faltering or stumbling characteristic of a tired person. He was carrying little weight, which suggested light but deadly equipment. This was no fisherman lugging dozens of kilograms of catch and supplies. This was a warrior on a mission. More importantly, the executioner was calm. He was in no hurry and made no attempt to hide. He did not cover his tracks. He marked them. Ivan stopped at the stream where the killer had waded across. The water here was icy, and a normal person would have tried to jump over or find a bridge so as not to get their feet wet. But the executor stepped right into the water without trying to hide his trail. It was not carelessness, but a demonstration of confidence. He was following his own path and had no doubt that he had every right to do so. Standing by the water, Raven closed his eyes, trying to understand this man's logic. He was not running from the law. He was going to his refuge, having completed what he considered necessary. The tracks also spoke of his weapon. From the way he kept his balance and redistributed his body weight, Ivan concluded that he had a gun. But not a heavy carbine for large game, but something more maneuverable. Perhaps an old, time-tested, light but powerful rifle. Ideal for a single, accurate shot. Such a weapon left Redhead no chance, especially if the blow was delivered not with a shot, but with something blunt and heavy, as Raven had assumed. The killer didn't want noise. He wanted silence. They walked a few more kilometers. The taiga around them grew denser, the cedars closing in to form a thick, gloomy wall. Finally, Raven stopped. In front of him was a small crevice between two huge boulders covered with lichen and moss. The place was inconspicuous but ideal for a short rest. The perpetrator had clearly stopped here. There were traces that the police would have called accidental. A slightly shifted stone that someone had sat on. Several broken but not snapped branches, as if to mark the spot. It was here that Raven found his main clue, confirming that he was on the right track. The path of taiga justice. In a crack between the roots of an old cedar tree, stuck in thick moss, lay the very talisman he was looking for. It was tiny, almost invisible, but to Raven's eye, which knew these places and their unspoken signs, it shone like a signal fire. It was not just a piece of bone or fur. It was a thin, finely crafted ring made of deer antler, attached to a piece of old, tanned sable fur. The fur was worn, and the antler had been polished to a shine by years of wear. Such a talisman cannot be bought. It is passed down from generation to generation, and it belonged not just to some taiga dweller, but to a member of one of the most ancient, most closed, and conservative communities, which lived according to a charter that had not changed since the time of their great-grandfathers. These people avoided cities, did not recognize official laws, and led an almost monastic lifestyle, completely dependent on the taiga.
They had their own internal court, their own rules for the distribution of land, and a strict taboo on greed and excess.
Losing such a talisman, especially after such an important deed as the murder of Ryzhy, was not an accident, but rather a sign. Carelessness that could only be dictated by a complete lack of fear of being caught. The perpetrator did not hide. He simply completed his mission. The Raven picked up the talisman, feeling its weight not in his hand, but somewhere deep inside. It was a seal. The seal of that very unwritten law that old Zakar had told him about. Ryzhy had been executed for betraying the taiga, and the killer had been sent by the community to preserve their way of life, their belief in balance. The question, who killed him, no longer mattered. The questions were, who is he, and what should we do? Ivan remembered his years in the reserve, when he himself, driven by his inner code, had handed down verdicts that often ran counter to instructions from Moscow. He had saved Ryzhy because he saw in him the potential for redemption, for living according to the law of the taiga. But Redhead chose the path to the city, the path to excessive comfort, to betrayal of the land that fed him. Now that choice had led to death. And this was the most acute psychological conflict for Voron. His own mercy turned out to be a mistake, a violation of order. He spared a sick individual who ended up infecting the entire system, and the system was forced to reject her. The shadow, sniffing the crevice, whimpered quietly, as if sensing its master's growing tension. Raven, holding the talisman in his hand, realized that his investigation had now finally turned into a personal odyssey. He had to find this executor, see his eyes, and understand his motive to the end, not to turn him over to the police, but to confirm or refute the fairness of the taiga's verdict. His own code of honor demanded it. He turned and, leaving behind tracks that led even deeper into the wilderness, began his return journey. He needed to return to Efremov to give a false report that strayed from the truth and buy some time. Time to decide what to do with a man who had broken the official law but defended the law that was sacred to Voron. The sun was already setting, and the shadows cast by the cedars were long and black, as if pointing to his own inevitable choice. Despite Raven's insistent demands for silence and the sanctity of the crime scene, Captain Efremov's office was filled with the same almost palpable bustle and confusion as the clearing where Redhead had been found.
Folders, papers, cold tea in glasses. All of this spoke of the chaos that Voron despised more than anything else in the world. Efremov himself, a 40-year-old man with a tired, puffy face, met him at the table, nervously tapping his pencil. He was waiting not so much for a report as for a version that could be filed away with the case and quickly close this taiga problem.
Context. Ivan's relationship with the local police had always been tense, but strictly functional. For them, Voron was not so much a consultant as a last resort, an almost mystical remedy when conventional methods failed. They respected his phenomenal ability to read the wild, but despised his contempt for their work and urban lifestyle. For Voron, they were helpless amateurs who came into conflict with the taiga as soon as they left the asphalt. He only communicated with them because sometimes he needed official permission to continue on his way, and they needed a clear, albeit false, trail. Now he had come not to turn in the killer, but to sell them his version, which would buy him time. Development. Ivan did not sit down. He took a notebook covered in his small, illegible handwriting out of his breast pocket and placed it on the table. This was not a robbery or a quarrel over prey, Captain. This was murder. He paused, allowing the weight of the word to settle in the stuffy office. Efremov nodded, urging him to continue. We understand that, Ivan Andreevich. But who? Why? He's a poacher. He has enemies like mosquitoes in summer. Voron leaned his hands on the table, Heppa's winter ice. The evidence suggests the following. The killer is one person. Strong. Experienced in the taiga, but not a vagrant. He doesn't make any unnecessary movements. He doesn't panic. He went about his business calmly, knowing that Redhead wasn't afraid of him. Ivan talked about the tracks, about the carelessly abandoned carcass of a roe deer, about the fact that Redhead's clothes were not torn in the struggle. He laid out all the facts that were obvious, but at the same time skillfully excluded those that led to the truth. Voron did not say a word about the bone amulet he found in the crevice. He also kept quiet about Redhead's excessive greed and the snares set too close together. He created a picture that could have been true but wasn't. My version. Redhead was taken out by one of his competitors who had been working that land for a long time. Perhaps it was the prospectors who were illegally mining for gold. Redhead began to visit the area frequently, crossed their path with his greed, and became dangerous. They decided to get rid of him, but not for the skins. They wanted to show that the area was occupied. Efremov perked up. The gold miners' version was perfect for them. First, it took the heat off the local communities, which had always been difficult to work with. Second, it gave them a reason to bring in federal forces and blame them for everything, including the lack of resources. They didn't need the truth about taiga law and unspoken courts. They needed a hook for the big city. Prospectors. Excellent. Efremov took a pencil and began to write something down hastily, his handwriting shaking. You've given us a direction. Where did the trail go, Ivan Andreevich? There, towards the Black Mountains. Voron nodded, slightly contemptuously. The Black Mountains were a huge, impenetrable massif where anyone could hide, and where the police would definitely not venture without support. It was the perfect alibi for the executioner.
Voron felt a cold disgust growing inside him. He was lying. But he was lying not for the sake of the criminal, but for his own personal, inner balance.
If he named Matvey now, and the talisman and Zakhar's words left no doubt that it was Matvey, the guardian of taiga customs, who had done it, the police would rush into the taiga without knowing what they were looking for.
They would not catch Matvey, but they would destroy the community that lived by its own rules and protected the taiga from sick individuals.
He remembered how, several years ago, he himself had been fired from the reserve for crossing paths with an influential official who wanted to build on the riverbanks. That time, the official law had betrayed him.
He knew that this law was powerless here, beyond the asphalt. No direct evidence, Captain, Voron clarified, his low, hoarse voice sounding like steel scraping against stone. Only my conclusion, based on the tracks and logic.
Look for their camp. Traces of heavy equipment or explosives. That's their signature. He deliberately directed their attention to material evidence that Matvey, as a true taiga, would never have left behind. Efremov, satisfied, stood up and extended his hand to Ivan.
Thank you, Voron. Now we have a version for Moscow. Go. Rest. Voron did not shake his hand. He just looked down at Efremov.
His gaze conveyed his entire philosophy.
You people in uniform are looking for the law written on paper. And I am looking for the order written in blood and snow. I'm not resting, Captain. I'm continuing the investigation. My code has been violated. I must see it through to the end. Yefremov did not understand the true meaning of these words, mistaking them for professional zeal. Ivan left the office, leaving behind the stifling world of power and indifference. He concealed the talisman, concealed the true cause of Ryzhy's death. Greed, which became a mortal sin in the taiga. He understood that the police would not catch Matvey, even if he gave them his name. They did not understand the logic of taiga justice. They would not catch a man who considered himself not a criminal, but a guardian. His path lay further, to the one who knew all the unwritten laws, to the old debt that Voron had to pay in order to understand what exactly made Matvey take on the role of the executor. He stepped out into the frosty air, and the shadow waiting for him on the porch pressed against his leg, as if confirming that the two of them were walking the only right, albeit dangerous, path. For Raven, a real investigation always began not with the examination of a dead body or protocols, but with living words, with unspoken history. His path lay to Fyodor Igorich, an old hunter who lived far from the villages in a half-abandoned border post, like the last guard on the border between civilization and the wild. Fyodor Igorich was not just an informant for Ivan, but a living archive of taiga laws and legends. His wisdom was not bookish, but forged by time and cold, and it could shed light on the true meaning of Ryzhy's murder. The border post stood on the high bank of the river, hidden from view by a thick spruce forest. When Ivan and Shadow approached it, Fyodor Yegorich was already waiting on the porch. Even though Raven had not warned him of their arrival, the old man was incredibly thin, but wiry, like an old vine. His eyes, under his overhanging eyebrows, were bright and sharp, seeing not just a guest, but his inner turmoil. He was one of those people who seemed to understand the taiga better than himself. He knew that Voron had not come for no reason, that his heavy gaze, for which he was famous, was now burdened with doubt.
Voron did not beat around the bush. He took the amulet he had found in the crevice out of his pocket and placed it on the old cracked table standing in the street. The horn ring and piece of sable fur looked out of place against the wooden boards, but Fyodor Igorovich immediately understood what it was. He did not pick it up, but only stared at it intently, and his face was clouded with deep sadness.
"A mark," the old man whispered hoarsely, and the word sounded like a sentence. "A seal, Ivan Andreevich. You cannot escape it." Ivan began to slowly and in detail tell the story of Ryzhy,
About how he had sped in the first time, about his greed, about how he had begun to spoil the land, leave carcasses to rot, and set snares where he shouldn't have.
He recounted the facts, but his voice betrayed an inner desire to understand. Had his mercy been a mistake? And Fyodor Igorovich, listening attentively, finally raised his head and looked directly at Voron. "Your mercy, Ivan, was for a man who was hungry. But the hunger passed, and in its place came insatiability. And insatiability is a disease, something that destroys not only the person himself, but everything around him. You try to fix something alive, but it chose decay." It was here, in the old man's words, that the main revelation for Ivan lay. Fyodor Igorovich explained that the murder of Ryzhy was not a common criminal offense, but an act of taiga justice. He spoke of unwritten laws that are older than any state code, and which communities have preserved for centuries because their survival depends on these laws. The first and foremost commandment: do not disturb the balance. Ryzhy did not just steal. He violated the very essence of this balance. He became a sick individual who, if not removed, would infect the entire community with fear, attract the police and inspectors, and ultimately lead to complete ruin.
The one who killed him acted not as a criminal, but as a doctor, amputating an infected limb to save the body. Fyodor Yegorovich exhaled heavily. For us taiga dwellers, Ryzhy had long since ceased to live. He was a walking death sentence for our children, and they made their decision.
Voron nodded. Now he understood why the murder had been so cruel and professional, yet devoid of personal hatred. It was the fulfillment of a duty.
Not revenge, but the preservation of order. Ivan showed him the amulet and asked, "Who is this?" Fyodor Igorovich was silent for a long time, his gaze sliding over the spruce forest as if he were asking permission from the taiga itself. Finally, he uttered the name that Raven had already suspected. Matvey. Matvey Ivanovich. He's the oldest here, the most respected, the most guardian. Matvey's name sounded like the distant rumble of a bell. He was a man who lived like a legend, a man whose word was law for everyone who lived in this wilderness. He was one of those who had never left the city, who believed that the taiga was a living organism, and that man should serve it, not take from it. Fyodor Igorovich said that Matvey was the one who had once saved the community from an attack by gold miners, who had led them through hungry winters, who had taught the new generation to respect the old laws. He was not just an elder. He was a taiga warrior, a guardian of traditions. For Matvey, killing Ryzhy was not a right, but a duty. He was the one who gave Ryzhy his last warning, Ivan Andreevich. The old man continued. He asked him to stop, and when Ryzhy laughed at him, Matvey realized that he couldn't handle it himself. That's when fate intervened, or something like that. Fyodor Igorovich raised his head to the sky, where a dim Siberian light was breaking through the clouds. The Raven felt his personal conflict intensifying with every passing minute. On the one hand, the law of the state,
which he had once sworn to defend, demanded that Matvey be captured. Matvey was a murderer.
On the other hand, his own code of honor, his understanding of justice, completely coincided with Matvey's motive. Ryzhy had signed his own death warrant by becoming a threat to the entire ecosystem. Ivan was tormented not only by the fact that Matvey must be punished, but also by the fact that his own mercy was, in essence, a miscarriage of justice. He should have removed Ryzhy from the taiga, but he did not do so, and now he had to pay with blood. Matvey is not hiding, Ivan Andreevich. He is waiting.
He knows you will come after him, Fyodor Igorovich said quietly, as if giving his last words of advice. For him, you are the final judge. He knows you understand why he did it. But you are the law. You will have to choose. The old man picked up the amulet from the table and handed it to Voron. Matvey left this for you. He knew you would find it. Voron took the bone and felt its cold weight. It was an invitation not to a duel, but to a final judgment, where he, Raven, would have to choose between official law and taiga justice. Now he knew who to look for. He was not looking for a criminal, but for a man who considered himself righteous. A man who had decided fate in order to save his world. Ivan Andreevich nodded. He had to find Matvey, and this meeting was inevitable. Silence in the taiga is not the absence of sound, but its perfect, harmonious order. And when this order was disturbed, Voron felt it with his whole being. He left Fyodor Igorich's cordon, taking with him not only Matvey's talisman, but also the heavy realization that now he was looking not for a criminal, but for an executor, acting according to a law that was almost sacred to him. His purposeful search began. Now Voron was following not the trail of a murderer, but the trail of an idea. Matvey, as Fyodor Igorovich had assumed, was not hiding. He had merely gone deep into his ancestral lands, to places known only to a few. Voron used the amulet as a kind of compass, knowing that a man who had left such an important mark would move according to his own logic, along the paths where he felt like a master, not a fugitive. This was the difference between a criminal who was running around in fear, and a warrior who had completed his mission. The shadow following him carried the same calmness. Laika sensed neither fear nor aggression, but concentration, the scent of an old, familiar person. The raven made his way through the dense, almost impenetrable forest, where every step required attention. He read Matvey's handwriting, and the deeper he went into the taiga, the clearer the image of the executor became. This man did not use modern fast methods. He moved slowly but steadily, as if he were the living embodiment of the taiga itself. He did not break branches. He walked around them. He did not step on the moss. He glided over it like water. Ivan found Matvey's first trace in an abandoned winter hut, which, judging by all appearances, had not been used for years. The place was remote, ideal for a temporary rest stop. It was empty, but for Voron it was filled with information. Matvey spent no more than 3 hours here, resting and preparing for the rest of his journey. He did not light a fire, eating what he had with him, the remains of crackers and dried meat. On the shelf, Raven found a neatly stacked pile of dry bark. It was strange. A man who didn't light a fire collected bark for some reason. This suggested that he was preparing to spend the night somewhere else, where a fire was necessary.
The most important thing was how Matvey treated the winter quarters. Before leaving, he tied it up, leaving everything perfectly clean, as if apologizing to the hut for his short stay. He even propped the door jamb with a small log so that the door would not open in the wind. This was the mark of a man who respected the place that had sheltered him, not a vagrant, not a murderer for profit, but an old hunter for whom these abandoned huts were sacred places of taiga life. Raven felt respect for the executor, but this respect only exacerbated his inner conflict. Respect for the motive versus the need to obey the law. The shadow led him further, to a high mountain pass where real crunchy snow already lay. Raven knew that Matvey was heading for his goal, the place where he had probably lived most of his life, and where he felt completely safe. As he got closer, Matvey's tracks became less visible, but more meaningful. He was not following trails, but his intuition, using every rock and every shadow to hide his presence from prying eyes. He behaved like a beast going to its lair. After a day of continuous travel, when the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, Raven finally reached the place he was looking for. It was a small but incredibly sturdy hut, built of thick logs, sheltered from the wind in a ravine, next to a small stream that did not freeze even in severe frosts. And most importantly, Matvey was here. This was evident from the thin, barely noticeable column of blue smoke that lazily curled above the chimney. Matvey was not hiding. He had simply returned. Voron left Shadow in hiding, ordering her to wait. He took out his binoculars and carefully examined the hut. Only one movement was noticed: the short, sturdy silhouette of Matvey, who came out onto the porch to gather firewood. He looked older than Raven had imagined, but his movements were strong, measured, filled with the inner confidence that is inherent only to the true masters of the taiga. He had a rifle leaning against the doorframe, but he did not stand guard. He stood calmly. He waited. At that moment, Voron realized that Matvey did not consider himself guilty. For him, killing Ryzhy was not a crime, but a salvation for the taiga. Ryzhy had become an abscess that could burst and destroy their fragile world. And Matvey, as the guardian, took on this heavy, bloody duty. Voron felt his own heart tighten at the bitter truth. His mercy toward Ryzhy several years ago had now turned into a chain of events that led to death. He had spared the one who should have been removed, and in doing so, he had upset the balance. Matvey, the enforcer, had simply corrected his mistake. The climax came not in the struggle, but in the realization. Voron lowered his binoculars. He knew he had to talk to Matvey, not as a cop to a criminal, but as a man seeking the truth to a man who had delivered that truth. Ivan Andreyevich Belov, Voron, felt himself at a crossroads. Now his personal code demanded not capture, but understanding. The murder was committed not out of hatred, but out of the conviction that he was saving the taiga. And Matvey was right according to the law, which was more important to Voron than any criminal code. But there remained the law of the people, which demanded blood. Voron stood up, his sinewy body carved from stone, tensing. He took the amulet out of his pocket and clutched it in his hand. He had to decide which law would take precedence over his own guilt and human weakness. His path led straight to Matvey, and this meeting was to be the final judgment for both of them. Voron had no obligations to the police, and he was not required to report to Efremov on his every move. After leaving the stuffy office, his path lay back to the very abandoned village where Ryzhy lived. But this time he was not looking for traces of the past, but for living evidence of the greed that had destroyed the poacher. He needed to see with his own eyes the unwritten sentence passed by Matvey in the way the murdered man's family's life had changed. Only by understanding what Redhead had chosen could he fully accept or reject the logic of the executor. Ryzhy's hut, unlike most of its neighbors, looked relatively new, which in a remote village meant that considerable, not always honest, effort had been put into it. On the outside it was covered with fresh, albeit rain-beaten clapboard, and the windows had bright blue frames, like cheap jewelry on an old, tired woman. It was this unnatural shine, this pretentious urban tinsel, that immediately caught Voron's eye. It didn't smell like survival here. It smelled like showmanship. Ryzhy's widow, Valentina, greeted him with undisguised wariness and poorly concealed hostility. She was still relatively young, but her face, lined with wrinkles from constant fatigue and discontent, showed that life in the taiga was a heavy, unloved burden for her. She held her youngest, frightened child in her arms, while the two older ones hid behind her wide skirt. Voron was not surprised that Efremov had been unable to get any useful information from her. Valentina saw every representative of authority as an enemy and had no intention of helping the investigation. Voron did not introduce himself or talk about the case. He simply entered, his heavy, calm gaze sweeping across the hut. Inside, there was a strange, disharmonious chaos that did not fit in with the harsh life of the taiga dwellers. On an old, crooked chest of drawers, next to an icon, stood a cheap, bright red radio. Synthetic curtains with a cloying floral pattern hung in the corners, and linoleum, which creaked underfoot, lay on the floor instead of the usual homespun rugs. All of this was alien, non-functional, and, most importantly, completely unnecessary in this place. "Who are you?" Valentina's voice was sharp and broken, full of bitterness. "The police have already been here. They won't find anything. Sergei was killed somewhere out there in the forest. Leave us alone. We've already lost our breadwinner." Without answering, Voron pointed to the electric stove standing next to the Russian stove, which, judging by its appearance, had not been used for a long time. "This stove is good. Why don't you use it?" Valentina pressed her lips together, anger flashing in her eyes. "We're not savages, Ivan Andreevich. We want to live like human beings. Sergei tried hard for us. He wanted us to have what everyone else has. The stove is convenient. No need to chop wood. Heat the stove." It was these words, this small, proud demonstration of someone else's urban comforts, that became the key to Voron's understanding of Matvey. Ryzhy didn't just want to feed his family. He wanted to change their way of life. He wanted to escape from a world ruled by harshness and self-sufficiency to a world where ease and consumption reigned supreme. He traded the law of the taiga for the law of the store. Voron noticed the children. They were not hungry, but they were dressed in new, bright, synthetic clothes, clearly bought in a hurry in the city, which were unsuitable for the taiga climate and looked ridiculous. He remembered how, a few years ago, when he had spared Redhead, the children had been dressed in patched but warm clothes sewn from old skins. Back then, they were part of this world, Now they were victims of his ambitions.
Valentina, apparently deciding to show that Redhead was a real breadwinner who provided them with everything they needed, went to an old chest, dusted it off, and opened it. Inside lay what was Redhead's final, most resounding sentence.
Not fur or canned meat, but new clothes.
Expensive, but meaningless for this place. A roll of wallpaper with a golden pattern. A women's synthetic robe with feathers. Several small, shiny trinkets, apparently bought with the proceeds from the last excessive loot. And most importantly, a small but very expensive imported chainsaw.
He wanted to build us an extension, Valentina said, pointing at the saw with trembling lips. He wanted the children to have their own room.
He wanted us to stop living like savages. Voron looked at this collection of artifacts of urban life. Wallpaper, a stove, synthetic materials. All of this had been bought at the cost of violating the laws of the taiga, at the cost of destroying the land, at the cost of betraying the community that lived nearby. Ryzhy, once spared by Raven, had himself become a sick individual, not because of hunger, but because of his greed for comfort. At that moment, Raven felt his personal conflict reach its peak. He himself had been fired for going against the authorities in order to preserve the balance in the reserve. His own code of honor, based on respect for the natural order, was his only law. And Redhead, whom he had spared, had violated that order. He had betrayed his way of life, for which, in Matvey's eyes, he deserved death. And Matvey, the enforcer, restored the balance. He committed a murder that was just from the point of view of the taiga. How many sables did he have this time? Raven asked quietly, his voice dull and low. Valentina shuddered. She was apparently used to questions about who was killed, but not why. A lot, she whispered, hiding her eyes. More than usual. He said it would be enough for the whole winter, and enough for wallpaper. Voron nodded. It was enough for death. Ivan left the hut, leaving Valentina alone with her glittering, unnecessary city dreams. The shadow rose and pressed itself against his leg. The Raven looked at the forest. He felt his personal conviction that Redhead was a sick individual finally solidify. But Matvey, who had killed him, had also broken the law of men. Now the Raven had to make a choice. The choice was not between good and evil, but between two kinds of justice, each of which required its own sacrifice. He had to find Matvey, not to condemn him, but to understand and decide how to restore order in the world, which the Raven himself considered the only just one. His path now lay to Matvey. It was not just a chase. It was a quest for the truth that would atone for his own guilt. The Raven was in the heart of the taiga, just a few kilometers from Matvey's hut, and it was the quietest, most tense point of his investigation. He stopped for the night at an abandoned hunting camp that he himself had once used. And now, this familiar silence allowed him to immerse himself in thoughts he could not escape. In his hands he held Matvey's talisman, a cold bone, a symbol of an ancient, unbreakable code. On the bench next to him lay his old knife, a symbol of his own personal code, which was now being called into question. For the first time in many years, Raven felt cornered. Not by an external threat, but by an internal truth. He stood at the crossroads of three truths, each of which demanded blood, but in different ways. The first truth was the law of the state. Murder is murder. Matvey violated the criminal code, and he must be punished. If Ivan turned Matvey in, he would fulfill his official duty. But in doing so, he would violate his internal law.
He would betray taiga justice, which he believed was more fair and necessary for preserving this world than any law written by officials thousands of kilometers away. The second truth is Voron's personal code.
Ryzhy was a sick individual. He finally understood this when he saw his greed and his city habits, which threatened the fragile balance of the taiga. Matvey restored the balance, but there was bitter irony in this act of restoration.
Ivan himself had once shown mercy, sparing Ryzhy, and that mercy had resulted in death. His own judgment had been wrong, his code compromised. Now, in order to restore his honor, he had to correct his mistake. But how?
To turn Matvey in
Would be to compound the mistake. To let him go would be to go against the law. The third truth was taiga justice. Matvey, the enforcer, was not a criminal. He was a guardian.
He acted out of the conviction that he was saving his community and the taiga itself from decay. From nature's point of view, his action was logical and necessary. He carried out an execution, not a murder. Understanding this was the hardest thing for Voron. He felt respect for Matvey, almost solidarity, as a man who had taken on the terrible burden of responsibility for order. Ivan left the camp and headed for the stream to fetch water. The shadow followed him, its amber eyes calm and attentive, as if it were the only silent witness to his inner struggle. Voron stood by the water, which was cold, clear, and relentless, like truth itself. He thought about Ryzhy. Ryzhy had chosen glamour and excess, and this greed had led to his downfall. He had been warned by the taiga itself, through the words of the elders, but he had laughed at the ancient laws. He had condemned himself, and Matvey had merely carried out the sentence. The Raven knew that his decision had to be orderly, not lawful. It had to bring order, not just legality.
The police, with their far-fetched version about the gold miners, had already lost track.
And Ivan himself had sent them down the wrong path. He had already broken the law of the state. Now, he had to finish what he had started.
To turn Matvey in would be to bring chaos to the taiga, which it would not be able to digest.
It meant that the community, protected by Matvey, would lose its backbone, and the police would get a false sense of victory without understanding the essence of the taiga law. He remembered his dismissal from the reserve, when his own righteousness was shattered by cynicism and corruption. Since then, he had ceased to believe in the ability of city law to protect his world. His world was the taiga, and in the taiga, the law had to be as pure as this water, and as relentless as winter. If Matvey had committed an act of justice, then his punishment should not be prison, which for him, a man of the forest, would be nothing more than humiliating torture.
The decision came to him not as a flash of insight, but as a slow, inevitable flow of the river. He had to understand Matvey, accept that he was right, but at the same time, not let him go unpunished. Murder is murder.
Even if it is justified, it leaves a mark, and that mark must be atoned for. The atonement should not be imprisonment, but exile. Matvey must leave the taiga forever, become dead to the community he defended, so that his sacrifice and his sentence would not be without consequences. Only in this way could Ivan restore his own code of honor, showing that even a just sentence must have its price,
The raven raised its head. The sky was black and clear, full of indifferent, cold stars. The shadow quietly touched his hand, as if giving its silent consent. Now Ivan had a path to follow. He had to find Matvey, meet him face to face, and demand not repentance, but atonement. This was his, the raven's, final, personal judgment. A judgment that would bring order, not just legality. He returned to camp, lit a small fire, and began to pack. Tomorrow, with the first rays of the sun, he would go to Matvey. It would not be a chase, but a meeting of two people standing on different sides of one invisible law. The path to Matvey's hut lay across a steep mountain pass, where thick morning fog, like cold, living milk, enveloped the cedars and boulders. Voron walked slowly, his step confident and unhurried. He was not afraid that Matvey would ambush him or try to run away. The executor of taiga justice fears no one but his own wrongdoing. And Matvey knew that sooner or later Raven, the guardian of balance, would come for him. It was not a chase, but an inevitable meeting, appointed by the very law of the taiga. The shadow, keeping a respectful distance, moved like a ghost, but its ears were strained, and its nose constantly caught the slightest changes in smells. Raven stopped when he was no more than 200 meters from the hut. He did not call out, did not signal. He simply emerged from the dense spruce forest and waited. And Matvey, as if sensing his presence through the thick fog, came out onto the porch. They stood facing each other in the white mist, two birds of prey of the taiga, two men, as if carved from stone and weathered by the winds. Matvey was older than Ivan. His beard was almost completely grey, and his face was furrowed with deep wrinkles. But his gaze remained sharp and heavy, filled with a strength that defied his age. He held not a gun, but an axe in his hands, an ordinary working tool, as if to emphasize that he was not a warrior, but a laborer. There was neither fear nor aggression in his posture, only a bitter, unbearable calm. "I knew you would come, Raven." Matvey's hoarse, low voice sounded in the fog without echo. "You always come when the balance is disturbed." Raven slowly moved forward, closing the distance. The shadow remained in place, its eyes fixed on Matvey. But there was no hostility in its behavior. It recognized him as an old but powerful beast. "You left a mark," said Ivan, his voice as quiet and low as Matvey's. He took the amulet out of his pocket and showed it to Matvey. "Too obvious a mark, Matvey. You didn't hide." Matvey, seeing the bone and fur, nodded briefly. A shadow of fatigue flashed in his eyes. "I don't have to hide. My business is clean. I had to let you know that this is not a thief, not a vagrant, not an accident. This is fulfillment." The Raven came closer, standing on the same invisible border where he had stood for the last 10 years of his life. "Explain, Matvey. Explain your truth, even though I already know it." Matvey did not try to justify himself or lie. He began to talk about Ryzhy. His words were slow and measured, as if he were chopping branches. "I warned him, Raven. 3 times. First, when he started setting snares too thickly, like a spider. Then, when he took a young doe, just for the skin, leaving the meat to rot. And the last time, when his greed almost hurt a child."
Matvey shifted the axe from one hand to the other.
The Redhead chose the city, Ivan. But he wanted to live here. He wanted the taiga to be his ATM. He didn't take to live. He robbed to buy his woman's synthetic rags and shiny dishes. He became a sick individual.
He didn't just break the law. He destroyed our faith. He could have attracted others like him here. He was pus that could infect the whole body. The emotion that Raven caught in Matvey's voice was not anger, but a deep, quiet sadness.
He killed not out of hatred, but out of duty. Matvey felt compelled, as if his hand were merely an instrument of the taiga's will. Your mercy, Raven, was his chance. You gave him a second chance to live by the law. But he disregarded it.
He laughed at your trust. He betrayed himself, and he betrayed you. I just corrected the mistake. Ivan was silent, digesting Matvey's words. There was no lie in them. He himself had seen all these alien artifacts of greed in Ryzhy's hut. He saw how his own mercy, his belief in a person's ability to reform, had turned into tragedy. He spared the one who should have been removed, and thus allowed evil to grow. You speak of the justice of the taiga, Raven finally said.
And I agree with it. But murder is murder, Matvey. You took upon yourself the right not only of a judge, but also of an executioner.
You broke the law that not only protects the community, but also gives it a place in the world of men. Matvey crossed his arms over his chest, leaning on his axe. I am old, Raven. My days are numbered. For me, prison is not punishment, but shame.
But my cause is purer than those who sit in offices and sign papers allowing cedar trees to be cut down and rivers to be poisoned. I saved the community. I saved the taiga.
You must understand that between official law and taiga justice, there is not just a line, but a chasm. And I jumped into it. There was no plea for mercy in his eyes, only a willingness to accept any outcome. He was ready to fight, ready to die, but not ready to admit he was wrong. There was no enmity between them, only a bitter, unbearable clarity of understanding. Two guardians who understood differently how to restore order.
What now? Asked Raven, his gaze heavy as lead fixed on Matvey.
I am the law. I gave Efremov a false lead, bought us time, because I know you don't belong in prison. But I can't just let you go. You broke the law, and my mercy must not be a second mistake. Matvey waited, his face remaining impassive, as if carved from granite. He waited for the verdict that Raven, a man standing on the border, would deliver in this fog, where neither police instructions nor city conventions applied. The trial had to take place. The conversation in the fog, which began with a confession, had now turned into a philosophical duel, where each man argued for the righteousness of his own law.
Voron, standing opposite Matvey, felt his unyieldingness, his pure, albeit bloody, confidence in his mission.
Matvey spoke of protecting the taiga, of saving the community. And there was no falsehood in his words. I will not argue with your motive, Matvey. Raven's voice was hoarse but firm, like hardened steel. Redhead condemned himself. He chose greed, and that greed was a plague. You saved the community from this plague.
From the forest's point of view, you are right.
He paused, allowing these words,
for full of unspoken respect, to settle in the silence. Matvey nodded briefly, his stern face showing no satisfaction, only a deep, inner weariness from what he had done.
But you have questioned a law that is above both of us, continued Raven, his gaze sharpening, piercing through the fog and time.
You have taken upon yourself the right not only to find Redhead guilty under the law of the taiga, but also to carry out this sentence. You became both judge and executioner. And that is power. And that power, Matvey, cannot be absolute.
No one can have absolute power over another person's life, even if they have violated the sacred order. Matvey, leaning on his axe, slowly raised his head.
You speak of the law of men, Raven, the one that gave you a license to chase poachers and then threw you out when you got in the way of an official. That law has no power here.
It didn't protect Redhead from his own greed, and it won't protect us from others like him, who will come after him. Who should have done it? You? The police? His voice was filled with bitter, undisguised contempt for the city authorities.
Voron felt a twinge. Matvey had hit a sore spot, his own disappointment in the official justice system. But it was precisely this disappointment that made his code so strict and pure. I'm not talking about the law in books. I'm talking about order. Your cause was just, but your method was not. You have set a precedent, Matvey. Now anyone in the community who has a grievance or feels that someone has wronged them can take up an axe and declare themselves the enforcer. That is not order. That is chaos, wrapped in righteousness. Ivan took another decisive step in this dialogue. He revealed his own, most serious guilt which had brought him here. A few years ago, Redhead stood before me, Matvey. I found him with traps, a backpack full of furs. He was hunting to save his family. I saw in him not a sick individual, but a hunted animal. I spared him. I took his prey, warned him, and let him go. I violated my duty as an inspector, deciding that my mercy was a more just judgment than prison. The Raven caught his heavy gaze. You didn't kill Red because he was greedy. You killed him because I made a mistake. My mercy was a mistake. I should have taken him out of the taiga, but I didn't. I gave him a chance, and he used that chance to become even worse. Your murder is a direct consequence of my first mistake. You brought the sentence that I couldn't deliver when I should have. My code of honor was violated, and Redhead paid for my weakness. These words, an admission of his own guilt, struck Matvey harder than any reproach. His stern face trembled. He lowered the axe, and it thudded against the porch log. For the first time in this meeting, Raven saw not pride in the executor's eyes, but deep human pain and understanding. He realized that Redhead was a victim, not only of his own greed, but also of a chain of events set in motion by an unjust trial. You couldn't have known, Ivan, Matvey said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. You acted according to your conscience then. Conscience is only part of the code, Matvey. Order is the whole thing, Voron replied, his voice growing stronger. To restore order, I must do more than just turn you in or let you go. If I turn you in, I will destroy your righteous deed, and you will die in a cage, betrayed by the city. If I let you go, I will cover your murder with my mercy, which will make me no better than you, but without punishment. And you will remain here, knowing that I, the law, have turned a blind eye.
That will not bring order.
The raven moved even closer, so that Matvey could see every wrinkle on his face, every mark left by the wind and time. Your sacrifice was necessary, but every action must have its price.
Your punishment must be as pure and relentless as the law of the taiga that you defended. It must bring redemption. Ivan was preparing to deliver his own third sentence. A sentence that was to be the final point in this story of broken balance. Voron's words about the disturbed order and the need for atonement hung in the air, heavy as a sentence that cannot be revoked. Matvey stood motionless, his old and wise eyes carefully studying Ivan's face. He waited. He was ready. The old taiga dweller, believing in the justice of his actions, feared neither death nor prison. But deep down, he did not want his cause, his sacrifice, to be tarnished by city bureaucracy or chaos. The conflict between them was palpable. Matvey, the enforcer, was ready to fight. He could easily grab his rifle or rush at Ivan with an axe. He was stronger and knew this gorge like the back of his hand. But his eyes showed fatigue. He did not want blood, especially the blood of a man who, as he understood, shared his views on the law of the taiga. Even though he adhered to a different personal code, he waited to see what sentence this man, Raven, whose word carried more weight here than any article of the criminal code, would pass on him. "You speak of atonement, Raven," Matvey said, his voice hoarse, like the creaking of a frozen tree.
What atonement can there be for a man who saved his land from contagion?
Ivan slowly shook his head, his gaze remaining calm and unbearably attentive. He did not reproach. He judged. A just punishment must be pure, Matvey. But you committed murder. You took on too much. And murder, even a just one, leaves a mark that can be the beginning of chaos. If I turn you into the police, you will rot in a cage, and your community will be inspected, disturbing their peace. Your sacrifice will be meaningless. If I let you go just like that, I myself will become a violator of order, one who turned a blind eye to bloodshed. He paused, and the moment stretched out in the fog like a harbinger of the inevitable. I won't turn you in to the police, Matvey. I've already sent them on a false trail, to the Black Mountains, to the prospectors. But I can't let you go either. Your punishment must be such that you atone for your guilt before the law of men. But do not betray the law of the taiga. You must suffer a punishment that will be harder than prison. Matvey, sensing the firmness and something new in his words, tensed up. He had expected either a duel or release, but not a third way. Your sentence, Matvey, is exile, said Voron, and the word rang out like a gunshot in the silence. You saved your community from Ryzhy. Now you must save it from yourself. You must leave the taiga forever. Leave your land, your hut, your name. You will become dead to your community, to all this land that you have defended. Matvey shuddered. His stern face was contorted, not by fear, but by deep inner pain. Exile. For a man of the taiga who had lived here all his life, who could not imagine himself without these mountains, streams, and cedars, it was a punishment far worse than imprisonment. Prison was a temporary deprivation of liberty that would end with his return. Exile was death while still alive, the complete and irrevocable loss of everything that gave meaning to his existence.
"I can't," Matvey began, but Voron cut him off without raising his voice. "You must, Matvey. You have committed an act of justice, but at the cost of blood. The price of that blood is your isolation, your voluntary death to this world.
If you stay, the police will find you sooner or later, and chaos will return. If you leave, your sentence, your execution, will be the last.
Your deed will remain pure in the eyes of the community because you left, accepting your guilt before the higher law, which is above the law of the taiga, the law that I, Raven, carry with me." Voron did not give him time to think.
He took a small but tightly packed bag of supplies out of his backpack. Crackers, dried meat, a few cartridges for a light rifle, and a map marked with little-known passages to the border. That was all he needed for a long, lonely journey.
You have 24 hours, Matvey. As soon as the fog clears, I'll return to the winter road. I'll give Efremov false evidence that will make them look for someone else. I'll say that the tracks disappeared in the swamps.
But if I find your tracks here in a day, I'll come after you. Not as a judge, but as someone who enforces the law of the state.
And then you'll rot in the city.
Matvey, as if encountering a force he could not overcome for the first time in his life, lowered his shoulders. He looked at his hut, at the stream, at the cedars that had kept him peaceful throughout his long life.
To leave forever. To leave everything that was dear to him, everything that made him Matvey, the guardian. It was the most bitter and purest payment for his righteous sin.
There was no hatred for Voron in his eyes, only a bitter, unbearable understanding that this man had not only sentenced him, but also given him redemption. You're right, Raven, Matvey said with difficulty. Order must be restored.
I will pay.
He did not take the bag of supplies. He picked up his axe, went into the hut, and came out a few minutes later, carrying only his old, light rifle, a hunting knife, and a small, dirty backpack. He left behind everything superfluous, everything that could remind the community of his existence. He had become a ghost. The Raven watched him. Go to the border, Matvey, and don't come back. You no longer belong to this taiga. Matvey nodded, without saying another word. He walked to the edge of the cliff, where the fog was beginning to thin, took a last look at his hut, and disappeared, moving with the same confidence and silence with which he had come to judge Ryzhy. The shadow lying in the spruce forest whimpered softly, as if saying goodbye to a part of its world. The Raven was left alone in the cold, dissipating fog, which now seemed clear and thin. His code had been restored, but the price was enormous. He had to return to the police and complete his false trail so that Matvey could make his last, difficult journey. Matvey's words, his silent acceptance of his sentence, hung in the air, mingling with a dissipating mountain fog. Ivan Andreevich Belov turned and began his return journey. He did not look back. He knew that Matvey would keep his word. Exile, voluntary death to this world, was a punishment for Matvey that was harsher and purer than prison. Now the Raven had to complete the second, no less important part of his sentence, to protect this act of taiga justice from the intrusion of human law. He returned to the winter road where he had left his SUV late at night. Captain Efremov's police squad, having received a vague tip from Ivan about illegal gold miners in the Black Mountains area, was waiting for him at the nearest village police station. This building, reeking of dampness, stale coffee, and bureaucratic melancholy, was for Voron the embodiment of the chaos and inefficiency he so despised.
Yefremov's office was a mess, but there was no fire in it, only a frenzied desire to report back and close the case. The captain instantly perked up when he saw Voron.
He was waiting for specifics that would allow him to write a nice report saying that the trail had been picked up, and the criminals, that is, the mythical prospectors, were being pursued.
"Well, Voron, did you find their camp?" Yefremov asked, his voice full of nervous impatience. "We're ready to give the order to comb the area. Just tell us where to look for traces of heavy equipment."
Voron, his face carved from stone, sat down opposite him.
He spoke slowly, in a low, hoarse voice, carefully choosing each word so that it sounded as convincing as possible, while completely covering Matvey's tracks. He began to weave his false story, based on grains of truth. "The tracks lead to the Black Mountains, Captain. The version with the prospectors is confirmed. The Redhead apparently crossed their path because of his greed."
Raven pointed to a false route on the map, a chain of old, abandoned trails that gold miners could indeed use to bypass the posts. "I found signs, Captain."
They worked quietly, professionally. But this is not a local hunter. These are outsiders. The handwriting is foreign. Yefremov took notes, trying not to miss a single detail, but his attention was focused only on the names that could be included in the report. He was looking for confirmation of his convenient version, not the truth. However, Voron paused, and this dramatic moment made Yefremov look up from his papers. "The trail has gone cold. In the area of the old beaver pools, I went further and found signs of heavy flooding. Everything was washed away. Several kilometers of swamp, and then the mountain range begins. You can only get there on foot now, without equipment, which rules out their quick escape." "But there are no traces." He added that the deceptive maneuvers used by the killer were too professional to belong to a simple poacher. He hinted at special training and methods used to mask one's presence. It was a subtle psychological trick. Matvey, as the executioner, was indeed a professional. But Voron presented it in a way that was understandable to the police. Military. Training or experience in security. "I found a small cache on their route." Voron lied deliberately to reinforce his version. "Leftover food, canned goods. No game, only city food. These aren't taiga dwellers, Captain. These are people living on imported goods, working in shifts. They're hiding there in the Black Mountains, waiting for us to stop looking for them." Yefremov leaned back in his chair, satisfied. His face expressed relief, mixed with pride. "Excellent, Voron. The gold miners, the outsiders, fled to the mountains. We'll give our people the tip. Let the Air Force work if necessary. The first stage of the case is closed. We have a motive. We have a direction. We have someone to look for." He didn't care that Ryzhy had been killed for his greed, or that Matvey had carried out an act of taiga justice. What mattered to him was that on paper, the killer had been found and sent to an inaccessible area. Voron watched his fuss with his trademark contempt. Efremov had already begun calling his superiors, reporting on the consultant's brilliant conclusion, and how they had almost caught the criminals, who would now be listed as actively wanted. He manipulated the facts to comply with city law. Statistics, but Voron manipulated him to protect the Taiga order. Ivan Andreevich, we will pay you your fee. Thank you for your help. Without you, we would not have found this lead, Yefremov said, pleased with himself, and held out his hand.
Voron shook it this time, but only with his fingertips. He felt disgust at this exchange. Lies for money. Peace of mind for lies. My work is done, Captain, said Voron, his gaze heavy, full of elusive reproach. Just remember, the taiga does not tolerate greed, and those who violate it always meet their end. Yefremov, busy with his reports, missed the philosophical subtext of these words, taking them for a routine warning. Voron left the office, leaving behind the stifling world of power and indifference. He had made his choice. He did not betray Matvey to the law of men, and he did not let him go unpunished. He handed down a third sentence: exile. Now he had to return to his world, to his hut, to understand what this act of justice had done to his own soul. The shadow was already waiting for him by the car, her amber eyes looking toward the mountains, where Matvey was making his last, lonely journey. Raven got behind the wheel, feeling his inner code of honor, like a broken bone, slowly and painfully healing. He needed to return home and restore order within himself. The silence that greeted Ivan Andreevich in his hut was different. It was not the tense silence of anticipation with which it had all begun, but a pure, sparse emptiness that remained after a difficult task had been completed. Voron returned home on the third day, tired but calm. He was in no hurry. He knew that Matvey, a man of honor and law of the taiga, would keep his word. He left. He accepted the sentence of exile, a punishment that was, for him, a man inextricably linked to this land, more terrible than any prison. The Raven returned, not with victory over the criminal, but with restored order. He lit a fire in the stove. The ritual was simple and unchanging, like taiga life itself. Kindling, dry wood, slow, growing heat. While the stove hummed, Raven took off all his traveling clothes, which had become heavy with moisture and the smell of smoke, and began to clean his weapons and equipment. Each movement was focused, meditative, allowing his weary mind to slowly, piece by piece, digest what had happened. His internal code of honor, which had been shaken after Redhead's murder, was now slowly and painfully healing. He realized that his mercy towards Redhead, shown several years ago, was not a sign of weakness, but a misjudgment of human nature. He had given a chance to a man who had chosen greed for excess over survival. And that mistake had led to death. Matvey, the executor, had corrected the mistake, but at the cost of breaking the law of men. Ivan Andreevich, in carrying out this final personal judgment, did not violate any of his main rules. He did not betray Matvey to the law, which was powerless here, and would have brought nothing but chaos. He did not allow him to go unpunished, because murder, even justifiable, required atonement. Exile became that atonement. A pure and cruel sentence, according to a law that Matvey understood. A law where the most terrible punishment is the severing of ties with the land. The Raven felt exhausted, but his soul had found a peace that had long since left him after his dismissal from the reserve. He had restored not just justice,
but order. He had taken his rightful place. His territory was not dusty city offices and neon-lit streets, but the border where the laws of men and the laws of nature collided. He realized that it was at this border that he could be the only one capable of administering true justice.
He was a bridge between the world of civilization and the world of the taiga, and only he could make decisions that would bring balance. He took Matvey's talisman out of his backpack, a small, cold bone. He held it in his hand for a long time, feeling its historical, almost mystical weight. It was a symbol not of crime, but of heritage.
Matvey, who had gone into exile, left his mark, his message: keep order. The raven did not keep the amulet. He walked over to the stove and threw it into the fire. The bone burst into flames, then turned black, dissolving in the heat. Thus he ended Matvey's story, leaving behind only ashes and silence.
The shadow, which had been watching its master all this time, approached him and laid its head on his knees.
Ivan ran his sinewy, calloused hand through its thick fur. The dog's affection, its silent, unconditional trust, was his only reward.
He expected neither praise from Efremov, who had already reported on the gold miners who had fled to the mountains, nor gratitude from Matvey's community, which might never know the true cost of his exile.
He sought only his own inner balance, and he found it.
The philosophy that guided Voron now became sharper and clearer. He does not seek revenge. He seeks to restore order.
For him, the most terrible crime is a violation of the natural course of things, and his job is to put everything back in its place.
Matvey restored order to the taiga, and Voron restored order to the law.
The price was high, but balance had been restored.
He got up and went to the window. Outside it was night, thick, black, full of rustling shadows that now seemed to him not a threat, but part of his world.
He felt that his place was here, on the border.
He was the raven, a bird of prey, imperturbable and attentive. And he would be here when the law of men clashed with the law of nature again. He would wait. He would judge. He would enforce order.
Ivan Andreevich Belov sat down in a chair by the stove. His gaze, heavy, calm, and incredibly attentive, was fixed on the fire. He knew he had made the right choice. This was not a story with a happy ending.
It was a story about truth and redemption, where even justice demanded sacrifice.
Now the balance had been restored, and a quiet, bitter sadness set in. The night was calm, the taiga slept, and the raven slept with it.